Welcome to the Debt Crisis Problem Podcast, your source for insights into major risk events that could trigger an economic downturn and debt crisis. Today we're discussing another key risk, deficit spending. Our goal is to create risk awareness and spark a healthy debate for the average citizen. The world is too fragile to wait. We need fresh candor and common sense. A debt crisis looms due to the unsustainable debt and deficit spending everywhere. It's time to wake up and speak up. Let's get started. Don't you wish you could spend whatever you wanted? Maybe you do. Do people realize we are all living off a giant credit card? In a way, the U.S. government is spending your money for you, and you may not realize the high level of deficit spending. You're certainly on the hook for it. Your future taxes will be used to repay just the interest on the spending done on your behalf. The U.S. government lives off a giant credit card through deficit spending. Because you are required to pay taxes to the U.S. government, you are directly tied to the massive credit card spending, as you and your posterity are responsible to repay the government's debts. The U.S. government has the power to tax your earnings however it wants. Furthermore, if the U.S. government had not been deficit spending like it has, the economy you enjoy would not be here, but would be there. It's a completely debt-funded, debt-fueled economy. Without all that spending, the marketplace would not be able to function. Eventually it might, but it would have to crash first. If the U.S. government were to live within its means, like a balanced budget of receipts and disbursements, the economy would fall apart anyway. Deficit spending at almost every level is what society wants because hardly anyone is speaking up. We are selfish at large, and we want to live off the giant credit cards, even at the expense of future generations. The American consumer seems to splurge on credit cards even when red flags are waving, for food and entertainment even. We do not want to have to cut back and live within our means. It would cramp our lifestyle and standard of living. Many of the excesses would surely dry up if we lived within our means and had budget plans. In the end, some people will argue for wealthy and large corporations to pay more in taxes, and others will argue for cutting non-defense spending and reducing taxes. All this arguing only results in a tiny adjustment to the level of deficit spending that may happen over the next 10 years and does nothing whatsoever to solve a now baked-in debt crisis. It will happen. A debt spiral will occur and the gloves will come off. It can't go on forever and it will have to bust. So we plug along year after year, the hole getting deeper than ever before, the plane flying farther and higher past the point of no return, until one day confidence is lost. The U.S. government will not be able to sell off its bonds at these low rates any longer. Credit risk increases due to the enormity of the debt levels. It will result in higher interest rates. When there is a default, interest rates will skyrocket, untold money will be printed, and inflation, stagflation, and high unemployment will set in and ruin the party for possibly decades to come. Asset prices will also likely collapse. Even as people collectively come to realize this, the spending addiction will prevail, but people will be forced to live within their means, or a reduction in their standard of living. Do something about it now. But that doesn't mean you can't right-size your personal financial well-being and get out of debt yourself as soon as possible. If you're in an untenable situation debt-wise or stuck with heavy debt, there are ways to manage and even renegotiate your repayment plan in the future and still maintain a reasonable standard of living, as best possible anyway. Meanwhile, the U.S. government, corporate America, and the private sector will continue to drive up debt levels from deficit spending more than is taken in, and more monies will be borrowed to cover the deficit spending and interest payments thereon, until one day soon the natural consequences of heavy deficit spending will set in. The collective heavy burden of overwhelming debt will negatively impact everyone. Until then, do something about it, or you'll regret doing so. Let's talk about the recent history of U.S. deficit spending and the projection through the year 2031. 24 trillion more in deficit spending? Annual trillion-dollar-plus deficit spending from 2020 through 2031 totals $24 trillion in just 11 short years. How sustainable is that? And if some other disruptive events come, how many more trillions than that will be added to the annual deficit and national debt? What are the odds that there won't be multiple events and disruptions? At what point does the debt bubble burst and default conditions result in higher inflation and higher interest rates? Or stagflation with the higher rates and declining growth? Or could it result in the collapse of asset bubbles? The $24 trillion deficit spending comes from the Congressional Budget Office as of May 2023. So, is not a day of reckoning coming? One honest question to ask is, how will the debt be funded, or at what costs? The U.S. Treasury will need to issue new debt to cover these deficits. But unlike the past decade when interest rates were much lower, what interest rates will investors bid at the upcoming U.S. Treasury bond auctions? Not if, but when they finally come to realize the federal deficit spending is not sustainable. Are not foreign investors starting to back away from the U.S. dollar? If investors worry about getting their money back, isn't the risk premium going to increase? And how substantially? And the Federal Reserve Bank is going to have to print even more new monies to cover the gargantuan deficits, besides rolling over trillions in low interest rate bonds. Interest rates will also continue to remain high for even a longer period, which will exacerbate the cost of servicing existing debts. All these points indicate that a day of reckoning is coming soon. Endless bailouts. In the past, the Federal Reserve Bank stepped in with its easy money quantitative easing programs and bought up the U.S. Treasury bonds and securities itself, just printing money digitally. How risky is that? The fundamentals of having the marketplace set the rates by itself was wiped out. They spread out the debt liability on the backs of every taxpayer in the country. But who even realized it? Woohoo, it's party time! But interest rates should have gone higher many years ago before the Federal Reserve Bank bought the securities and printed the money. Had it not intervened, the market would have just set the rates so things would have become stronger sooner. But the U.S. government took the easy way out, extended the limit on its national credit card, and America has lived off of it and its false lower interest rates all these years. It just kicked the can down the road and flew the plane further and higher past the point of no return. The U.S. government propped everything up with artificial printing of money, a total house of cards, so things wouldn't crash. When the feds buy the unwanted bonds, it can add to inflation. Now, when it crashes, it will be much worse than it would have been if markets were unable to react naturally per the markets. The combination of greedy investments supported by bad fiscal policy, which is spending, and monetary interest rates, all those policies have managed to keep the lights on, but the consequences will always come sooner or later. Let's talk about the 2023 U.S. credit rating downgrade. Maybe you didn't even know that. Check out Fitch Ratings back on August 1st, 2023, where it says, quote, "The rating downgrade of the United States reflects the expected fiscal deterioration over the next 3 years, a high and growing general U.S. government debt burden, and the erosion of governance relative to AA or AAA rated peers over the last 2 decades that has manifested in repeated debt limit standoffs and last-minute resolutions. In Fitch's view, there has been a steady deterioration in standards of governance over the last 20 years, including on fiscal and debt matters, notwithstanding the June bipartisan agreement to suspend the debt limit until January 2025. The repeated debt limit political standoffs and last-minute resolutions have eroded confidence in fiscal management. We expect the general U.S. government deficit to raise to 6.3% of GDP in 2023 from 3.7% in 2022, reflecting cyclically weaker federal revenues, new spending initiatives, and a higher interest burden. Over the next decade, higher interest rates and the rising debt stock will increase the interest service burden, while an aging population and rising healthcare costs will raise spending on the elderly absent fiscal policy reforms. The CBO projects that interest costs will double by 2033 to 3.6% of GDP. The CBO also estimates a rise in mandatory spending on Medicare and Social Security by 1.5% of GDP over the same period. The CBO projects that the Social Security Fund will be depleted by 2033, and the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, used to pay for benefits under Medicare Part A, will be depleted by 2035 under current laws, posing additional challenges for the fiscal trajectory unless timely corrective measures are implemented. Tighter credit conditions, weakening business investment, and a slowdown in consumption will push the U.S. economy into a mild recession in fourth quarter 23 and first quarter 24, according to Fitch projections. This short ad is sponsored by the TunaBudget.com podcasts. Hey friends, looking to improve your personal and financial wellness? Don't miss the Tuna Budget podcasts at TunaBudget.com. Download your free Tuna Budget Worksheet Plan, the most powerful budget worksheet plan in the world, yours. In addition, dozens of Tuna Budget's human-side candid conversation memos may be the perfect answers you're looking for. Join us for the real candid conversations and candid questions that can change your life for the better. Subscribe to the TunaBudget.com podcast and empower yourself to take charge of your future and financial well-being. So what was the U.S. Treasury Department's response to the 2023 credit downgrade by Fitch Rating Service? According to the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on August 1st, 2023, quote, I strongly disagree with Fitch's rating decision. The change by Fitch Rating announced today is arbitrary and based on outdated data. Fitch's quantitative rating model declined markedly between 2018 and 2020, and yet Fitch is announcing its change now, despite the progress that we have seen in many of the indicators that Fitch relies on for its decision. Many of these measures, including those related to governance, have shown improvement over the course of this administration, with the passage of bipartisan legislation to address the debt limit, invest in infrastructure, and make other investments in America's competitiveness. Fitch's decision does not change what Americans, investors, and people all around the world already know, that Treasury securities remain the world's preeminent safe and liquid asset, and that the American economy is fundamentally strong. Interesting. The 2023 Penn Wharton on debt to GDP warning. This is interesting. According to Penn Wharton in October of 2023, the budget model, when does federal debt reach unsustainable levels? Okay, let's see what they have to say. The U.S. public debt outstanding of back then $33.2 trillion, it's over 35 now, often cited by media, is largely misleading, as it includes $6.8 trillion that the U.S. government owes itself due to trust fund and other accounting. The economics profession has long focused on debt held by the public, currently equal to about 98% of GDP at $26.3 trillion, for assessing its effects on the economy. We estimate that the U.S. debt held by the public cannot exceed about 200% of GDP, even under today's generally favorable market conditions. Larger ratios in countries like Japan, for example, are not relevant for the United States because Japan has a much larger household savings rate, which more than absorbs the larger U.S. government debt. Under current policy, the United States has about 20 years for corrective action, after which no amount of future tax increases or spending cuts could avoid the U.S. government defaulting on its debt, whether explicitly or implicitly. For example, debt monetization producing significant inflation. Between 2040 and 45, or in about 20 years, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio will hit between 175 to 200% under current fiscal policy, depending on the assumed interest rates. Continuing, unlike technical defaults where payments are merely delayed, this default would be much larger and would reverberate across the U.S. and world economies. This time frame is the best case scenario for the United States under market conditions where participants believe that corrective fiscal actions will happen ahead of time. If instead they started to believe otherwise, debt dynamics would make the time window for corrective action even shorter. Interesting. So in conclusion, so what, when, and how does this deficit spending affect you, this risk? Out of control spending risk. The annual $1 trillion plus deficit spending from 2020 through 2031 totals $24 trillion in new debt in just 11 short years. My gut says it will be much larger. Compounding this problem, think about how the U.S. not repays but mostly refinances or just rolls over its old bonds or debts as they mature. The new pricing is not going to be at the low interest rates that we've seen in the past. They will be refinanced at higher interest rates. That and all the new debt eventually will converge to become a mess. Confidence in the U.S. dollar will be lost. Credit risk, or the risk of non-repayment or default, will increase, resulting in skyrocketing interest rates as untold money will be printed. We will see inflation, stagflation, spoiling the party for everyone and possibly for a decade to come. Asset values will have to reset or even collapse. If people were truly aware of the gravity of this situation, they would agree with this troubling outlook. People will be scrambling to right-size their personal finances and get out of debt as much as possible. All debt. But the national debate will not happen to the extent it should until it's too late, when the people will be forced to live within their means, which will result in a reduction of their standard of living. And those who will be stuck in an untenable debt burden situation, they need to relax. There are ways to manage, even renegotiate their debt repayment solutions in the future and still maintain a reasonable standard of living as best as possible. Deficit spending addiction will lead to a debt crisis. Again, the deficit spending addiction the U.S. is experiencing can only result in a debt crisis because it has not been, nor is it, sustainable for some time. Hardly no one is willing to talk about it, though, because most know that the fix is in, those that are aware. We the people cannot make it without relying on debt. Politicians know it, and they take advantage of it. They spend the taxpayers' money for generations to come, mostly for political purposes. We've become a very selfish people and no longer have the interest of others in mind. People really like living off a giant credit card with all the stuff it buys and the higher but unpaid for standard of living. Untold trillions of your and your posterity's money are being spent by the leaders you elected, not to mention the officials they've appointed. Are we the people not responsible to repay such debt? Maybe you don't support certain elected officials, but did you decide to not even vote? Maybe you will decide to vote next time and choose different leadership. Unfortunately, to avoid a debt crisis up to this point, the U.S. debt spending addiction has resulted in a propped-up economy. It requires a heavy dose of deficit debt spending to survive. It cannot be shut off at this point. What will happen will happen. A little common sense will tell you what's going to happen. Once again, the result of this year-over-year spending mess is an enormous, ever-expanding federal debt burden. The other unfunded liabilities that need to be paid out are completely unsustainable. Paying anything less than 100% of what's owed means only one thing: default or the endless printing of money, the same effect as default. The effects of a default time will come in the near term and result in a debt crisis. I sincerely believe it cannot be fixed at this point, and we are in a dangerous red flag waving period. When it does happen, the U.S. will be forced to print more money, resulting in inflation pressures, raise taxes and cut its spending, or miss making payments. It still means insolvency or default. Debt payments will be paid out with much less worth money. That's a default. Who out there will have an appetite for the needed reform and austerity measures? Will local, state, and federal taxes need to climb to 50% of your income? Get your attention? My opinion is that there will be seasons of default and restructuring beginning no later than 2025 for any given number of reasons, probably for 5 years, and then have to restructure for the following 25 years. Living within a budget is no longer possible. You've heard how important it is to live within your means, like within a balanced budget, right? You don't deficit spend or spend more than you take in unless you're into carrying credit card balances. And for many people, that won't have a savings plan built into that budget. It would just be more important to live below your means so that you have some money to put into savings. You get the point. You have to have a cushion to take care of emergencies, etc. As long as you're not deficit spending or borrowing money, especially for normal living expenses. As noted, however, for the U.S. government to live within a budget so that there's no deficit spending is not even possible, even if it wanted to, without destroying the economy. It would be like slowing a roller coaster too quickly at a very high speed. Good, like trying to get through that. There's just too much going on. It's going too fast. Too many are living off of it. And the 20 Risks in the Debt Crisis podcast, those events will only result in more and more deficit spending. All this will lead to an eventual debt crisis in the near term, like I said. It purposefully cannot be fixed at this point, only slowed down until the next risk event occurs, as there are too many political interests keeping a balanced budget from ever happening. Politicians know a balanced budget can't possibly be put in place, and it never will be until a major debt crisis happens and certain pressures are forced upon us. Even then, it will likely still not happen. Politicians constantly talk about reducing the deficit over the next decade, but none of them will ever do it. They have never done it. Hundreds of billions of dollars are scattered all over the place. It's been the same excuse given for several decades, but the national debt has only increased and is now dangerously high. What will be the resultant increased risk of not having and following a budget? Here's a dozen points to get you started. Higher inflation, higher interest rates, debt levels not being reduced, less economic growth, loss of confidence at the consumer and investor levels, poor credit rating leading to higher debt service costs, no spending accountability of U.S. government officials, heavy debt repayment burden on your grandchildren, higher taxes paid, reduced competitiveness because of being strapped, civilian instability, and eventually debt repayment default or a debt crisis. No one should be buying it any longer. People need to speak up. But for you, your family, your business, you can do something about it. Start with a pro forma budget plan for the next 1 to 2 years. Start planning, making changes today. If you have debt, get rid of it. Anything that is beyond modest. Especially. Opportunities come from great upheaval too, but only if you're in a position to get through it, as opposed to digging your way out of a heavy debt burden. Okay, I want to go back to the Penn Wharton budget model for a moment. I believe that model is misleading, that I mentioned earlier. It effectively illustrates how the economics profession, in my opinion, focuses on the debt held by the public to GDP as its economic barometer. Because $6.8 trillion of the debt, or about 20.5%, is from the U.S. government owing itself. It says including the $6.8 trillion is largely misleading. That's what they say it is, if we include it. So it's not included in how they use it for assessing its effects on the economy. And it only makes the debt to GDP ratio at 98% instead of much higher, like 122%. Are they serious? Apparently they are not. To me, Penn Wharton's viewpoint of not including the gross debt owed by the U.S. government and maybe they should even include as a discussion on the impact of having to fund the U.S. unfunded liabilities commitments too, is largely misleading. In their argument, they also conclude that the U.S. debt held by the public, that it cannot exceed about 200% under today's favorable market conditions. So they're saying if you exclude the debt held by the public, their ratio, which is 98% to GDP, can go to 200% before things fall apart. And then they describe what happens when it hits 200. It's like, are you serious? In all seriousness, though, and reasonableness, though, if their outside projection is to use this 200% debt to GDP measure and not including the other 20.5% of the debt owed, even to itself, and all this is happening in just 20 short years, wouldn't you think they'd want to include a discussion of the other 20.5% of debt also owed? How silly is it to leave that out? It makes no sense at all. Did it not occur to anyone over there that as the 20 years fast approaches, that they will have had to pay the other 20.5% too? And somebody else please ask Penn Wharton about including an analysis of the unfunded liabilities, over $100 trillion more over the next 20 years. I doubt you'll get a response. Economists groupthink accounting. That's what I'm calling this. If you don't look at the debt to GDP number through the Economist groupthink accounting method and just use a bit of reason, this entire model makes little or no sense at all. The national debate must include the gross debt, since the U.S. government is going to have to pay all of its bills, and include unfunded liabilities too. It doesn't have the money now, and it is going to have to pay those bills too. It's already spent. It runs deficits. You have to look at the strength of the U.S. economy using the gross debt, and not just look at the debt held by the public. Enough of the accounting tricks. It doesn't even matter, because all the gross debt commitments and the scheduled unfunded liabilities, along with all the consequences of any of the 20 risk events in this debt crisis podcast, are going to come into play anyway. It really doesn't even matter if in their economic profession they prefer to use their own accounting gimmicks. They will be greatly off on their current play it safe and still get their groupthink paychecks model projections. How simple, yet they all ignore common sense. Yes, groupthink is not only misleading, it's very dangerous too. It must stop. If it doesn't stop, it won't matter anyway, because they're all wrong. One can hardly wait to hear all the excuses and blaming. No one will take any professional responsibility. You watch. Credit rating agencies are finally speaking up. Finally, it is noteworthy that some rating agencies are recognizing the increasing credit risk profile of the U.S. with credit downgrades. Of course, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, now that she is the U.S. Treasury Secretary, a political role in the executive branch of the U.S. government, has changed her tune as she strongly disagrees with the latest August 2023 Fitch rating downgrade. Compare that with what she said in the first 10 years at the Federal Reserve. However, I believe the message I am raising needs to be discussed at every kitchen table in America. Most people in America will never have a clue as to what the rating agencies are even talking about. And this is a moral failure for the U.S. leadership to not sound a solid warning siren. If enough leadership sounded the alarms, there would be a national debate, and we can begin to prepare in earnest for the days ahead. Can you smell a debt crisis yet? Thank you for joining us. Today we explored deficit spending, a major risk contributing to the looming debt crisis. We hope to highlight the urgent need for transparency around these risks. We want to hear from you. Submit your own debt crisis memo and share your thoughts at tunabudget.com. If you found today's episode valuable, please subscribe for future podcasts. Your support helps us grow this healthy debate. Until next time, take all necessary precautions. Your financial wellness matters. Thanks again.